In this video, I'll introduce you to DomeMaker, our custom plugin that lets you quickly build complex HDRI dome setups, simplifies a range of otherwise complicated workflows, and enables you to achieve more realistic results in no time. So if you're a regular follower of my content, you might have seen my tutorial on how to build a custom HDRI dome setup in VRay, and one that's vastly superior to VRay's native built-in tools. And in this video, I showed various benefits, such as that you're able to view your entire environment directly in your native viewport in real time. You can generate richer, more realistic shadows that help your 3D objects integrate much better into the environment. You can add shading effects to the floor plane, such as bump mapping or reflections. And you can even enable advanced effects like wetness or water puddles. So while the end result looks far better than what the built-in tools can offer, it doesn't come entirely without drawbacks. For example, the setup process is quite slow and complex. Even for experienced users, it takes around 30 minutes to build, and there are countless ways things can go wrong. It's quite difficult to control. Many settings are buried deep inside the node graph and spread across multiple shaders. And most importantly, if you want to try out different HDRIs, you often have to redo parts of the setup, matching the floor plane again, adjusting shaders. All of this can really slow down your workflow. After the video, I was contacted by Phil from Flag Visuals, and together we came up with the idea to turn the entire workflow into a plugin that eliminates all of these drawbacks. And after months of development, we created something that not only automates the entire process, but also adds a lot more functionality on top of it. Well, this tool is called the DomeMaker, and it's available right now. And in this video, I will walk you through all of its features and show you how it can seriously speed up your workflow and take your renders to the next level. So now let's check out how we can use DomeMaker in order to make our life much easier and quickly turn this one here into a finalized scene. And for this, I just prepared this simple model. You can see we don't really have any lighting, no environment or anything like this set up yet. And we're going to be using DomeMaker for that. So after you install DomeMaker, you will have this icon here in the upper toolbar. Once you press this, you will have access to the user interface of DomeMaker. And here you can see that for now we have this red indicator, which means that currently no HDRI has been loaded. We didn't really set up our dome yet. So we can change it by just picking any HDRI on our hard disk. But you can see if you have a bunch of different HDRIs, it might become difficult to know exactly how each of those look like, because oftentimes there's not really a preview or anything like this available. So instead we chose to build in our own custom HDRI browser. And you can choose any folder on your hard disk, and it will generate all of those thumbnails here for you automatically. And like this, you will have a nice collection of the HDRIs that you have, and you can choose quickly which kind of environment you want to set up. For example, here, let's just set up this one in here by just double clicking on that. And you can see DomeMaker ran through a couple of procedures, and it fully automatically created here this nice dome setup. If you want to try out a different HDRI, you can quickly open the browser again. Let's choose this one, for example, and it will do its magic, run through the same procedures, and just basically replaces everything with its new HDRI. Let's choose another one yet again, for example, this one in here. And you can see how easy it is to test out different HDRIs and see how your model behaves in them. So now that our HDRI dome is set up, we have a bunch of different options to further customize this, of course. We can choose here a different scale and make the dome much bigger or smaller, depending on our needs. Let's put it back to the default size. We can also change the projection, so we can choose different kind of projections. As you can see, we can make it higher or lower. In this case, we would have probably some projection like this here that would make sense. And then we would also scale up here our dome a little bit bigger, so that the relationship between the car and our parking lot looks more or less correct. So now I'll move the camera inside of our dome. You can see how well this here works, how nicely this model is integrated now in this environment. We can also change the rotation of our dome here by just dragging the slider. And like this, get also different kind of looks because it changes then the light direction. So here we have a bit more of a frontal lighting. And if we go to, for example, this rotation, we have a bit more of a backlit feeling. So let's keep on working with this and see what other options we have available. A little bit further down, you have the option to define the brightness of your dome environment. And let's go increase that. So you can see we have a much brighter result now, of course. Or we can also make this much darker, and that would be similar like stepping down with the exposure of the camera. So all of the highlight details and so on are fully preserved, but you have the option to just do this here directly on the fly through the user interface. What you also have is the option to define the brightness of your lighting and the background separately. So you can see at the moment those would be locked. Let me unlock those. And now I can just take the lighting and increase that. And you can see that the model now is much brighter, even though the background here stays dark. You can also adjust the background here separately. And like this, you have the option to get customized looks. Of course, normally here, this one would be locked and both of them would be adjusted here at the same time to get physically accurate results. But you also have the option to get a fully customized look by just unlocking both of them and then get exactly the result that you want to achieve. Another nice feature is the ability to adjust the white balance of the HDRI. This is not just applying a filter on top of the whole image, it's really changing the white balance of the HDRI itself, so it's not really messing with your shaders and so on. And you can do that here in the white balance slider. So once I do this, let's say we want to have this more yellow. You can see the floor was temporarily hidden so that we can get real-time performance. And then it's performing the color matching. So here you can slide back and forth. And you can get relatively real-time performance to see what you're doing. And once you've found the white balance that you like, you can just release that and will rematch the colors of the floor so that everything will match together perfectly. Let's try again to make it more cool this time. And you can see you can quickly get a completely different look out of this just by playing with the white balance. So now let's explore all the options that we built in for rendering. And here I just have another scene with this character in this case. And what we have here in the upper part is the ability to render this here with different render engines. And at the moment we have access for VRay and VRay GPU. So this one here would be CPU, this one here GPU. And you can immediately switch on the fly between them. So this one here is the CPU version. And now if I switch this to GPU, it will reinitialize the scene. And now we're in GPU mode. And you can see how seamless it is to switch between them. And you get exactly the same appearance. Later on, you will also see we matched all of the bump maps, reflections, and so on. So that you can seamlessly switch between both engines without having any kind of visual difference here in your final output. So at the moment, we're rendering using the GPU in IPR mode. So that means it's a separate window that you can see in here. This gives me also a chance to show you that we render all of those different render elements, so the normal paths, ZDAPs, and so on. And those render elements, they actually can slow down your rendering and you only might want to use them for the final output. So what we did was to add here this extra button where we can disable the render elements. Once I do this, you can see that this list now is much smaller because we only use the render elements which are necessary for the denoising. And for the final rendering, you can just enable this back again. And now you can see you have all of those originally set up render elements here back. So right now we're rendering in the IPR mode. So that means we have a separate IPR window for our rendering and a separate window for our viewport. But you can also combine that in the same window. And for this, you can switch here to the viewport IPR. And then once you start the rendering again, you will see that now the viewport here acts as my IPR. And you can do that all seamlessly now in one and the same window. You can do the same, of course, for the GPU. So let's switch that. And now we render directly in the viewport using our GPU. Of course, you can also switch this here to full screen so that your entire view will be used for rendering if you have the render power for that. In terms of rendering, you also have these two options. First of all, we can flip our HDRI. So you can see if you want to, for some reason, mirror your HDRI because, for example, your fonts or markings in those here are not displayed correctly, you can easily flip that. And we also have this special invisible mode. So once we enable this, you can see that we hide our background. We only show our model, but we still use the HDRI here for the lighting, reflections, and so on. So you can separate your model from the background if you think that's a bit distractive. And it also gives you the option to define how your background looks like. For this, we can jump here to this material and background tab. And inside here, we can enable or disable a vignette. We can customize the vignette here. And we can also customize the color that we want to see here in our background. So now opening our browsers without changing our overall feeling of the scene, we can quickly switch different HDRIs. And you can see this has a completely different look. Let's try this one here. And this is different again. And let's try another one. So you can see how easy it is to switch the different lightings here for our model without messing with the background, and you can quickly test out your model in different scenarios. Note that also we have these nice and beautiful shadows which are here on the floor, and depending on the HDRI that you choose, so for example, let's use one that has a strong sunlight, you get some shadows which come from the HDRI. Then of course you can also rotate this, and you can play with the exposure, and like this get exactly the kind of look that you're going for. So once we set up our scene using DomeMaker, we have access to a lot of advantages, especially in regards to our floor plane. So in order to access those, we can go to our material and background options. Let's first discover some basic options about the floor plane. So as mentioned, all of the color matching of the floor plane is done completely automatically in DomeMaker when you have this auto match color option enabled. But if you want to, you can also modify the existing match by just playing here with the brightness, for example. So you can make the floor plane brighter or darker if you want to. And if you want to go back to the original match, you just set the brightness here back to 0. You can also play with the hue of the floor plane if you feel the original match for some reason didn't really work well. So let's just find some extreme values in here. And this gives me also the option to show you the surface size slider. And by this, you can basically make your floor plane smaller or bigger and define where it transitions into the dome environment. If you mess up the matching of the floor plane, like how we did now, you can just click this button here and it will just rematch everything and make sure that everything works as intended. So now we can also play with the material of our floor plane, and this we can do here in the material options. Let's first of all enable reflections. And now you can see we have reflections on our floor plane, and this mirrors our dome and also our object that we place in our dome and can help to integrate that quite nicely in certain type of scenes. At the moment, of course, the reflections would be too strong and too glossy, so we can reduce the glossiness, for example, or we can also decrease the intensity in order to just have this much more subtle. Let's increase both of those again, because I want to show you that we also have the option to enable bump mapping, and for this it will generate a own custom bump map based on your projection. Let's enable the bump mapping, and then we have these nice bump effects here on the floor, which can also help a lot with integrating your model into the dome environment. You just need to be careful on the intensity. So right now I think it would be way too strong. Let's just reduce this to 25 maybe, and also reduce the bump amount to 2.5 and maybe add a little bit of glossiness in order to integrate this a bit more realistically here in our environment. You can see we still have these subtle reflections with this subtle bump mapping in here, and it doesn't really stand out that much anymore and helps a lot with the overall integration. Maybe we can raise this up a little bit so that we get the subtle reflection of the car or those barriers in here, and like this integrate our model even nicer into the environment. So with DomeMaker, we also have the option to enable water puddles. And for this, let's go over to this water effects tab. And it's basically as easy as just to click this button in here. And you can see we immediately have some nice water puddles here on our floor plane. Let's now see how we can customize that further. First of all, we can choose between two different modes. We have currently fractal, and this one here is the regular mode. So you can see the shape changes slightly. Let's go back to the fractal again. And the fractal ones have a little bit more variation in terms of size or shape. We can also define the overall size here by just making this bigger or smaller. And you can find some value that kind of matches your scene. Let me make this here to 5000 again, because I think like this, it roughly fits here to my scene setup. So if you like the overall scale, but you don't like where those puddles here are positioned, you can play with the seed. And just by choosing different seeds, you can get entirely different results. So then we have this detail slider, and this makes the shader of the puddles here react to the surface of the floor. You can see we have all of those details here on the edges. It breaks up in a nice and interesting way. If you want to reduce or disable this, you can lower down the slider, and you can see that you don't really have the same amount of details now anymore, but that can be useful for certain kind of situations. So now let's scroll down a little bit and let's discover the remaining options in here. So here we can define the distances of the water and the wetness. So let's just first reduce the water all the way to 0. And you can see that the water disappeared now. So now we can first define our distance for the wetness. So if I shrink this, you can see then the wetness only appears in few places. And if I grow this, then we have much more wet areas. The same we can do with the waters. Let me just grow that a bit. And you can see that we have some water puddles which are forming now in those wet areas. We can even make this bigger to overall grow the size of our water puddles. And I think like this, it looks nice for now. Furthermore, we have some additional options to change the brightness, for example, or the color if we want to. And you can get some crazy kind of effects. But I think the default values here are normally quite fine to get a realistic water puddle effect. Additionally, we can add some bump mapping here to our water puddles. Now, of course, it's way too extreme, but I just show you what's possible. And let's dial this down a little bit and maybe even a bit more. You can also define the brightness of the wetness, so you can make it darker or brighter. And then in the end, get exactly the type of look that you want to achieve. We also spent quite some time to make all of this work for both the CPU and GPU. And all of those values here are respected in both render engines and generate very similar type of results. So if I now change to the GPU, you can see that we get an almost perfect match between both of them. We have the same bump intensity, we have these same details here in the water puddles, and all of those look extremely similar compared to both render engines. So you can seamlessly switch between both of them and use these same settings in here. Finally, we have this camera section here, and this combines a lot of useful tools that you will need for any kind of camera work that you might want to do in the scene. And first of all, you have a list here. And this just shows all of the different cameras that you set up in the scene. You can easily switch between them by just clicking on the respective camera name, and it will automatically load the camera with all of the settings that you set up in here and make switching between cameras much more easy. You can also add more cameras, so let's just choose this one here as a starting point, switch this one to a perspective view, and let's say we want to make the camera like this here. So we create a new camera from view, and once we do this, you can see there's this new camera here now set up, and now we can also play with those settings in here. First of all, you have the option to move in and out, and you have access to all of the other relevant options. For example, you can enable depth of field. Let me just make this here very shallow so that we can see quite well what we're doing. And let me just pick, for example, here the wheel and make it even more shallow. So you can see now the focus is set up here on this wheel, and I can also switch it to the headlight here. So you can easily pick any part of the model that you want, and it will automatically set the focus to wherever you set it up in the viewport. Let's now delete this camera because we don't need it. And let's just switch to our previous cameras here. So since oftentimes these type of HDRI dome setups are used for turntable, we also added this handy turntable options in here. And at the moment, this car is in a group. So let me just open this group. So now we can select our group handle, and we can choose now one object where the camera rotates around. So we'll choose this group handle. And then once this is done, you can see we have a camera that rotates one time around our model. And then also the dome rotates one time around the model itself. And if you don't like the resting position in the end, you can easily change that by just choosing here a different object rotation, so like this, for example, and then everything will update accordingly. You can also choose here a different distance, so you can go in and out. You can choose different height options, and like this, create exactly the type of turntable that you want to. So if you want to get your hands on DomeMaker, you can head over to flagvisuals.com. There you can find here the section for DomeMaker, or you can also directly visit this link here or scan the QR code. So once you're on the shop page, you can easily purchase DomeMaker. The regular price will be $29.99, but since we're just launching, we provide you with a special launch discount code called DomeLaunch. And once you enter this, the price will be reduced $10 to $19.99. But remember, this will be a temporary code for around about 2 weeks. So check out if the code still works for you. Also, if you're one of my patrons, you can find a temporary discount code on the Patreon page, which will give you 50% discount. Also, please make sure to check out here the product page, where you can always find all of the latest features and information, and especially here the minimum requirements. At the moment, this would be 3ds Max 2025 or newer and VRay 7 or newer, but later on it might be that we also support different render engines, different versions and so on. So just make sure that whatever you're running is also supported here on the product page. So this concludes the review of our tool DomeMaker. If you like this kind of content, subscribe to this channel. Otherwise, see you next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.